Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dev.
Welcome back to Modus Cafe. And are you a beginner to board climbing? And if so, then this episode is for you. We're going to go over the top tips to get you started on a training board. Really, this is like an intro on how to get started. Both Katja and I use training boards often in our own training and to coach our clients. So we've got a jam-packed episode for you today. Okay, so to get started, I think we're going to start with like recommended boards. Katja, what do you want to start with, like your favorite boards or your recommended boards?
Yeah, I think it would be fun to kind of share what we personally like, or what boards we recommend people to start training on. But before we get started, I just want to emphasize that, we believe that, training boards is something that a lot of people could try to use. And today we want to just share a few tips on how to do that. I think there's a lot of nerves that sometimes people bring when it comes to wanting to train on boards, and people get really nervous or are tentative to get started, and we are here to help you at least try them out. Maybe they're not for you, and maybe you don't want to train on training boards. That's totally fine. But if you want to train on training boards and you just don't know how to get started and you feel intimidated, then we want to help you out today. And yeah, so this is a part 2, because last episode we talked about, just the advantages of training boards and the disadvantages. And if you haven't listened to that episode, you can head back. We just published it last week, I believe, or the week before last. And so head back to listen to our advice on that. But yeah, in that episode, we briefly talked about what are our favorite training boards to train on personally. So I'm going to get started. I have 2 training boards that I love personally. One is the Grasshopper board, which is not as popular as some of the other ones. I actually have a Grasshopper board at home, and the reason I chose to buy a Grasshopper board at home is simply because it just has some quite friendly, beginner-friendly / warm-up friendly holds, the set of holds. But I have a board where I can exchange the grips, handholds anytime I want to, but that's the reason I chose the Grasshopper board. The second reason that I like the Grasshopper board, not just because it has sort of beginner-friendly holds, but also because it's symmetrical. And I really like that about the Grasshopper board. It allows me to train positions, on either side. And my body is quite asymmetrical, and I think most bodies are, so I think it's really beneficial to do that. But at the gym, I am fortunate enough that I go to a gym where I believe I can probably find any of the boards available at this point, which is really wonderful. My favorite board is actually still the moon board, the old school moon board. And the reason for that is a few. I'm not so particular on feeling strongly about it being the right board. It's more just the board that I enjoy the most. I don't want to make arguments for why it's quote unquote the right board. It's just the board that I enjoy the most. And this is for a few reasons. So maybe just to summarize what boards are even out there. So we just talked about the Grasshopper board, the moon board. The moon board has a bunch of different setups. I prefer the 2016 setup simply because I also just know it better and I enjoy it still. There's a tension board. Now there's actually 2 versions of the tension board. There's a kilter board, which you've probably heard of. And sometimes when we talk about training on a wall, we also consider spray wall, and which is actually technically my favorite wall to climb on. A spray wall is just a wall that has a random set of holds. I love that the most when I train on boards. But if I had to choose a board, I would choose the moon board. The reason I like the moon board the best is because it's more of an elimination / comfort. Like I just know the moon board really well. So when I train on a board, usually it's pretty hard training for me. And so I like that I know the holds. That provides me with comfort. So I just don't know the other boards as well. That's probably the first reason. Again, I want to emphasize these are personal reasons. I wouldn't say the moon board is the best board to climb at. It works best for me. I have not exhausted, training on the moon board, so I can still train a lot on it. And I don't love the tension board. The tension board now also has some wooden holds that I know people love. And I have a really hard time with wooden holds in general. I have pretty sweaty hands, and I feel very insecure in them. There's a point to be made that maybe it would be good to practice climbing on them, but I feel like I just slip off in very uncontrolled ways. And I just simply don't enjoy climbing on the tension board for that reason. I just don't like the wooden holes. And the kilter board, I have done some sessions on the kilter board and I'm getting more excited about the kilter board, but I don't love it. And here's why still. And again, it might be a matter of me getting used to it. To me, I consider the kilter board mean. Now, you might think that's funny, but when I climb on the moon board, I can look at all the holes from the ground up, and even just looking at them, I have a sense of what they're going to feel like. You know, you can see if it's a bigger hold, if it's a jug, if it's a small hold, if it's in cut or not, what shape it has. But to me, the kilter board, if I look at the kilter board before I start my climb, all the holes have the same general shape, but then how in cut they are and whether or not they're slopey and what they actually feel like is quite different. And I remember when I climbed on the kilter board the first time, and I want to share this in case people try out the kilter board just to be prepared. When I climbed on the kilter board the first time, I almost hurt myself because I expected holes to be bigger than they are, because the whole shape is big. But then sometimes they're actually quite small when you actually want to use them. And I think it's really hard for me to still visually know what to expect when I climb on the kilter board. That's probably, to me, the biggest downside for the kilter board. But I'm actually getting back. I'm not getting back into it. But I'm trying to get into the kilter board just for different types of climbing, because the kilter board has some larger holes than the moon board. You can do some bigger moves on it, and I do enjoy that. So I think once I've really gotten to know the kilter board, I'll be able to really climb harder on it and do bigger moves. But that's kind of my main reason for why I would choose the moon board.
Yeah. Well, things are changing in my training board life for sure. So I have a Moonboard 2016. So I've had that in my garage for about 6 years or so. But that was really the first board I started using. I think it was probably over 10 years ago. Moonboard had just the yellow holds available. And so we had that at our gym, and we would actually train people on that board. And we would do a class on the moon board where we would start at 10 degrees, try a boulder problem, and then change the angle. Once everyone kind of understood the climb, we would make it a little bit harder, and then people can see kind of like what they need to work on. So the moon board has a very special place in my heart, but I'm not gonna lie, like it is very hard. I have a 41-degree board, and really up until recently, the moon board really was fixed at 40 degrees. Um, but now I believe there's two that you can choose from. I think there's a 25-degree and a 40-degree, where the climbs that show up on the app, there are established climbs on each angle. It doesn't mean you can't climb at other angles if that board can go to those angles. So the moon board, I think it's a really wonderful tool. It taught me how to try really hard on some really crappy holds. I think I've gotten to a point where the moonboard feels really repetitive now. I think that there are certain holds that I have not gotten really any better at. Like I can't really hold certain holds. And so I've noticed that a lot of the climbs that I can do and that I trend toward are very similar in nature. So that is one reason why I'm getting rid of the moon board. And the second reason is that, so I'm just kind of coming out of my injury, and I'm getting back to where I was before getting injured. But the process of climbing again on the moon board was really difficult. The moonboard starts at V4, but in reality, a moonboard V4 is much harder than a typical V4. And so I found myself getting really frustrated and sometimes really like angry with myself when I was coming back to climbing on the moonboard. And that's not what climbing should be about. Like I really just wanted to have fun on the moonboard, and it just like wasn't happening. And it took months for me to finally be able to climb V4 on the moonboard. And as well, like my wife Brenda, she's also a climber. She can climb V4, V5, even V6 outside, but really struggles on one just even trying to do 1v4 on the moon board. And so we can't really session together and have a good time in the garage. So I have decided to switch out my moon board, and I'm in the process right now of getting my tension board 2 set up. And what's great is that the density of holds, it's more than double the density. So that means there's, maybe 300 holds or something like that on the same square footage wall. So that means that I'm going to get more variety. Yeah, like there are wood holds, but there are also plastic holds. Um, and there's just a lot more to choose from. Like I highly doubt that I'm going to really run into the problem of being too repetitive unless I just keep repeating the same stuff over and over. And I am choosing to do a mirror style. I think a lot of people are pushing me towards the spray, but I really want to do mirror because of something that you mentioned, Katja, is that you can kind of test things side to side. I noticed that the moon board was very one side dominant. Somehow, like I was always working one side more than the other. And I think that's going to be true for the spray wall potentially. I think the way that the tension board set up the spray is going to allow for more symmetry, even though it's a spray wall. But I really want to make sure that I am training both sides equally. And for me, I just find I'm a coach. I want to be able to coach climbers on a training wall, and a systems board or a symmetrical board is going to allow me to do that. So I am going to go with the mirror option. Um, yeah, so that's like in general, like those two are kind of my favorites. The kilter board is really interesting. I think it looks beautiful. It's probably the most aesthetic board in my opinion. But again, that repetitive nature, I find that it feels very similar. All the moves feel similar. The holds feel kind of similar, either just better or worse, but the same shape. But I have not climbed on the kilter board as much as maybe some other people, and like that. It's okay if other people have a different opinion. That's just like what I've taken away, and from trying all of these boards, I am pretty stoked that I'm getting the tension board 2, because there is such a wide variety of hold types, and it is a little slipperier, so the feet aren't going to be as good. It's going to kind of suck, but because I climb on granite most of the year, I really need to get better at that kind of like toe tension. So those are my favorites and why I chose the tension board 2. Yeah, and then in terms of like recommending which boards, honestly, it's like whatever you have access to at your gym. And if you had to choose between a fixed board and an adjustable board, I would definitely go toward the adjustable board so that you can start off at a very low intensity. Most of these boards can start at V0 at maybe a 25 or 30 degree angle, but to make sure that you're not really jumping in head first, and potentially ramping up the intensity more than you should be, then you can decrease the angle and just start getting comfortable with what that board has to offer.
Yeah, I guess Mercedes started right with our number one tip for how to get started on boards. I briefly want to say that I very much resonate with what you said about the kilter board. I also find that a lot of moves feel similar to me. It's a lot of just big moves. So it's almost like if my intention is to work on like big moves, then I like to use the kilter board. But when I want to work a little bit more just on tension, because the feet tend to be pretty big on the kilter board too for that same reason. So when I want to work more on tensiony type stuff, that's more delicate but full of tension, then I choose the moon board most of the time. That's my style of climbing. But I want to practice more dynamic movement, so definitely more kilter boarding in my future as well.
Actually, that's something to bring up though, like the feet. Also, feet on a moon board. Most of the climbs are set so that you are tracking. It's called tracking. So whatever handholds you're using, you use those for your feet. And that's how a lot of the climbs are set. But on the tension board, there are specific feet for the boulder problem being set. So I think that's also what separates the tension board and maybe the tension board from all of the other boards. I know that the kilter board has some feet, but the tension board was designed specifically with terrible feet in mind so that they could highlight those and you can start using those. So I think that that is also kind of a benefit of using the tension board too, as well.
Yeah. And Mercedes loves terrible feet.
I do.
And I'm not joking. Like, no commercial gym set would have feet from Mercedes. All of them are way too big for her at all times.
Unless it's a slab. Okay, no. If it's a slab and there's a volume, I'd be like, I hate this so much. Yeah.
Yeah. But so to go back, I lost my train of thought. Those are our opinions. There are specific opinions to our climbing, our style, our preferences. Those opinions can and will probably change. And also, we have climbed on boards for a very long time. Mercedes said she's been climbing on boards for like 10, 15 years. I don't even know. A long time. 2016, probably when the first moonboard came out.
Oh, yeah. The first moonboard came out. Oh, God, I don't know. 2000, early 2000s.
I see. Yeah. And I started climbing on the moonboard, I would have to think it was definitely in Salt Lake City. I moved to Salt Lake City 7 years ago, so probably I would say 6 years ago is when I started climbing. So it's been a minute, and I want to share this because we just talked about some nuances that if you are new to board climbing, they might not matter as much to you. At the beginning, which board you choose doesn't matter as much, but we're going to give you a few tips. And the first tip that Mercedes actually started with, if you're new to board climbing and you don't know where to get started, we recommend choose a board that allows you to adjust the angle, because a lot of boards are hard climbing to begin with. And if you can't adjust the angle to a less steep angle, it's going to be even harder. Now, for example, the moonboard that I climb on, the 2016 in Salt Lake City where I climb, you can't adjust the angle. So that is not a board that I would suggest to people. But we do have a a different hold setup for a moonboard. There's so many now. It has the red holds. They're actually pretty nice. I believe it might be a 2018 hold setup. That moonboard at my gym, you can adjust the angle. That's the one that goes to 20 degrees too. It has climbs established at 20 degrees, but you can go all the way up to 0 degrees. It's completely vertical. And I do see people climbing on that. So that's the first recommendation that we have, is find a board where you can adjust the angle. So, because ultimately what we want for you to do is we want you to get to know the board. Get to know the board, get to know the holds, and get to know how your own body moves on these boards and on these holds. And it's really great to start at an easier angle, so you're not injuring yourself and you're really giving yourself the chance to get to know the board. So that's the first tip that we have. Find a board that has an adjustable angle. For example, in my gym, both the kilter board and the tension board, you can adjust the angles. On the spray wall and then one of the moonboards, you can. So it's always going to be different. I don't know what it's like in Seattle, Mercedes.
Oh my God. All of our gyms, I think most of the gyms now have adjustable boards. And I think across the country, more and more gyms are investing in these because they realize how valuable they are, especially if it's an adjustable board. And I think we might have covered this in our last podcast on board climbing versus commercial gym climbing, but you do kind of develop a culture around certain boards. And you tend to see the same people working on the same boards and you get to know them, which is like super awesome. But you want to make sure, just like Katja said, like we're going to go into some etiquette, but if you're going to see a group of people working at a certain angle, you might not be able to go up and change the angle between sets because that's going to take too much time. So you might have to find, I would say the first 3 sessions that you're going to be on a training board, it's like getting comfortable with the board, find out how to use it, how to use the app, what do the holds feel like, and definitely start at a less steep angle because bouldering in general is very high intensity. Then board climbing is even more intense than that. And then you've got this like super steep angle. So, a lot of, I would say, beginner climbers might not actually be physically ready for a 40 degree. You might have to start with 10 degrees, and that's okay. There's a reason why they're adjustable, so you can adjust it.
Absolutely. And the beauty of adjusting angles is that you try certain climbs at a less steep angle, and then you slowly make that angle steeper, and you slowly teach your body to do the same climb at a steeper angle. It's a really beautiful method to ease you into harder climbing, which is actually one of the things I love about the adjustable angles. And actually, that is how I do when I do climb on the kilter board. That is how I practice harder projects, because usually when I climb on the kilter board, I try to go for harder things. And that's what I do. I adjust the angle to a less steep angle. And I start at 10 degrees and I do the moves at 10 degrees. And then I go to 15, I go to 20, and then all the way down to where I want to go.
Yeah, I would say adjusting the angle is almost like giving yourself a power spot. You know, if you're doing it at a less steep angle, you're taking weight off of your hands and your feet. And so that is only going to be good for your movement to understand it more. So don't let your ego get in the way of you getting better at these boards. By saying no, I can't change the angle. I look weak if I'm changing the angle, and that's just like it's just not true. You know.
Absolutely. And you can actually do some really hard climbing on less steep angles. And I think, at least in my personal experience, I'm sharing my personal experience because I have seen this both in interactions with friends and athletes and clients of mine. This idea of climbing, especially on the kilter board, at a 50-degree angle. I feel like that's so popular right now. It looks super steep, and I think people love doing it. And if they enjoy doing it, they should do it. I personally don't think there's a need to climb at 50 degrees, but you might see, the reason I bring this up, you might see people do that and they might enjoy doing that. It's also, I want to just say, with the kilter board specifically, as we said, because of the hold types that you have, both for feet and hands, in order to make climbs harder, people often have to go to really steep angles to make the climb so much harder. You will find really hard climbs on other boards that have different holds and different feet at a much less steep angle. So find something that works for you.
And there should be a reason why you're training or you're climbing at a certain angle. If, let's just say, you're a gym climber and you don't go outside very much, I would say 30 degrees is actually a perfect, like, that is steep enough to get a lot of intensity out of climbs, and to be able to use smaller climbs, smaller holds and bigger holds. And remember, it's kind of like when we train isometrics in strength training, that if you're training at a certain angle, you're going to get benefits kind of above and below that angle. So if you're training at 30, you're going to get benefit if you, for some reason, need to climb at a 40-degree angle. If you're going to go to 50 degrees, man, I don't know actually why you would train at 50 unless you're going to Waco, or like where you're going to places that have really steep climbing and that you're preparing your body for. Like if you're training for cave routes, things like that. Otherwise, I feel like these super steep angles is a fast track to injury. The more overhanging on these small holds, the greater the intensity on the fingers and the elbows. So I just, I see the 50 degrees a lot. But I don't understand it. I think it really just feeds into people's egos. Like, if I'm being honest, I don't think it's going to be any better for you compared to like a 30-degree and using a variety of different holds. Anyway, that's my rant.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I agree with you. We tend to have, most of the time, we tend to have similar philosophies when it comes to training. Yeah. Every once in a while, we have different ones, which is very good too. Okay, the next tip that I would love to share for anybody who's new to board climbing and wants to, just get on and see what it's like. The first thing that I suggest is actually to climb without lights on, just initially, and just to see what the board feels like. I mean, ideally, this would be on a board where you can tell what the good holds are. Because, there's an advantage. You can choose a V0 and the lights will tell you where to go. Most likely give you really easy holds. So if you feel like you can't tell which ones are the good holds, you can turn on your app and try to find the easiest climb on the app. But I find it very, very informative in terms of getting to know the board to climb without lights and just getting a feel for the board and what the board feels like. And again, this would be at a very small angle to do that. At most boards, that is pretty easy to do. And yeah, the reason I suggest climbing without lights is simply because sometimes we can really get stuck on feeling like we need to follow a certain route when we turn on lights, and that can be pretty um, discouraging, especially if it doesn't feel very good on the board. If you're new to the board, it's hard to know whether or not you'll be able to do a given climb that you're choosing, and chances are really good that you will not be able to climb the same grade on a board that you might be able to climb in the gym set. I'm not saying that's necessarily true, but for most people, they just need a little bit of time to just get used to board climbing. So if you can climb V4 at the gym, V4 on a board might feel still quite hard to you, and that's okay. So you might want to start either without lights and just climb on the board for fun with the intention to just get to know the holes, and you just jump off as soon as it gets too hard. Again, the goal here is not even to get to the top of the board. The goal is just to get to know the holes of the board and the feed and the angle that it's set at, with while giving you some grace. And there's no judgment because there's no lights on, so you're not even trying to send a boulder.
Yeah, I like that approach a lot. It does take a little bit of I'm going to say creativity. It feels like you do have to think a little bit more when there aren't any lights because there's so many holds to choose from. So you do have to kind of take a moment and decide what holds you're going to touch, like which ones you're going to pull on, which feet you're going to use. But I actually think this is a really good practice in general to kind of come up with your own climbs based on where you're at. Kind of going back to the spray wall that Katja was talking about before, like if you take all of the lights away from a training board, it's really just a spray wall, and you get to come up with things on your own, you know. And one thing I like to do as a warm up to a training board is to keep my feet on the ground. Maybe my feet are just slightly in front of me and I'm holding on to holds, maybe at like head height. My arms are a little bent and I'm just like moving my hands around and I'm walking my feet across. It's almost like a traverse. And I'm just like feeling the holds and I'm warming up on the board. This could also be a really great introduction to just getting started on the board as well. So those are a few things. I also like the no lights is a similar to a drill that we do, which is called rainbow climbing. That would be like if you were going to do it in a commercial gym, if there were 2 or 3 climbs crossing over each other, you're open to using all of the holds. And again, it comes back to this creativity component, like expanding your brain and patterns by coming up with your own stuff. And I really do think that this is invaluable. It's such a great learning tool. And if anyone knows anything about the Japanese climbing team, like if you saw them in the Olympics, they're fantastic athletes. And a lot of them train on spray walls because of this learning component, and they have to come up with a lot of their own stuff. So I think the lights, like the no lights option, is so good. And you should definitely embrace that.
Yeah, actually, thank you for emphasizing this. It's really important to emphasize that this is not just like, oh, do the no lights. This is a beginner drill. Only people who don't climb on the boards should choose the no lights. No, like a lot of really, really, really good climbers climb without lights. So, just a few sessions ago, not a few sessions, I don't know, weeks or months ago, like I saw Michaela Kirsch climb on the moonboard, and she also didn't turn lights on. She was just doing certain drills on the moonboard. And in fact, when I train on the moonboard these days, I also don't use lights. So it's not just for beginners, as Mercedes said. It's really, really good. And that's actually one reason I also love this spray wall. It allows me to be really creative and really kind of like try things out and to see what I can do. Yeah, thank you for that, Mercedes.
All right.
Okay, should we move on to the next tip?
Yeah, go ahead.
So let's say, you're new, you listen to this podcast episode and you get started, climbing on the board, but even just climbing on the board without lights feels really hard to you, or even just choosing really easy climbs feels really hard to you, and you really feel like you can't actually physically climb on the board. What's another thing that you could do? Well, something you can do, even staying pretty low on the board without climbing too high, is what we call positional isometrics. It's a great training tool to use on these boards without actually climbing on them. And positional isometrics are really just kind of like a freeze on the board. So what you want to do is you choose 2 handholds and 2 feet. Ideally, those feet wouldn't be very good, but choose something that you can start with. So you put 4 points onto the wall, and all you do is you hold that position. And you hold that position, if you can, for 10 seconds, and then you come off. That's it. Even just that, because of how the boards are designed in terms of using tension, even if you just start with those positional isometrics, you're going to learn a lot about climbing in general, and you're going to learn a lot about climbing on the boards. And that's another thing that I love for people to get started when they start climbing on boards. And you can do this by using really low feet, just the kickboard. And you can do this by finding the positions that do work for you initially. And then the next step up from that, so you do that with actually a bunch of different positions. And the next step up from that would just be to try to move 1 or 2 hands without moving your feet. And this is similar to the drill that Mercedes suggests. What she does when she warms up, she keeps her feet low and she just moves her hands. But again, if you can't do that yet, if it's too hard to hold tension, maybe because your board is not adjustable, because I feel like I have an athlete, he's in LA, and even there, sometimes you still have boards that are not adjustable. And so that's one of the things that actually he's training with positional isometrics right now. It's been really helpful for him too. So it's my second favorite drill to do on the boards is positional isometrics, and then to move into what Mercedes said, which is now just moving your hands without moving your feet would be a really great way for you to get started on a board.
Yeah, and I really like this free form approach to training boards because you can really target certain things. Like, let's say you're not very good at maybe pulling up into a lock off. It doesn't have to be a full lock off. It could be maybe you're pulling up to 90 degrees in your elbows, and maybe that's something that you train because you notice, oh, I'm a little weak here, and you hold that position with your feet on, and you can hold that for 5 to 10 seconds. And actually, in our membership, we have a training program that everyone is on, and we have a session that is basically what we call skills drills. And you can do the positional isometrics. There's also 2 moves at a time, just working on specific things. You could work on specific foot techniques as well. Like, if you know that you don't know how to use a heel hook well, you can go to a training board and just try to practice how to place a heel. And so you can just have a session where you're just playing around and just trying to develop some of these like basic skills on a training board. And that is your session. It's going to feel hard by the end of the session, even if you didn't climb a ton.
Okay, I have one more tip for getting started on the board. I don't know if you want to add anything, Mercedes, before we're going to move on into etiquette. Sort of some tips around etiquette and how to get started, I guess, from a social perspective on the board, since they do tend to be crowded. So my last tip for getting started on the board is maybe a 2-part tip, which is, first is do not compare yourself to others. The training boards, based on the history of the training boards, they do tend to draw a lot of very strong climbers. And a lot of climbers who climb on boards, they have climbed on boards for a long time. So that's one reason why we see people often be intimidated when getting started on boards, is because, they see all these other climbers on boards that, look super muscular, do really big moves, and do, really crazy climbs. But don't let that discourage you. Everybody started somewhere, and remember, this is your journey. And if you want to improve your climbing, then you have to, start somewhere and put yourself in positions of learning, which is where growth really is at. So if you already knew how to use the board really well, you probably wouldn't need to train on it as much. So the point of training and learning something new is, to get better at something, which also means maybe we're not good at it yet. So don't compare yourself to others. And at the same time, I always love to tell people when they say, how can I say this? When people who are new to board climbing start climbing on the board, those tend to be intermediate climbers who have been climbing for quite some time. They're starting to train. They really want to get better. but because they're still new to board climbing most of the time, they might not be as strong as other people, which is why I said don't compare yourself to others. And at the same time, they can be frustrated that they don't see more people like them on the board, meaning more beginners on the board, right? Because often we see people who are pretty strong at the board. So I always like to tell people, if you want to see more people like you on the board, you have to get started climbing on the board to encourage others to also, climb on the board. It kind of goes along the lines with be the change that you want to see. If you are, brave and you bring some courage to just get started on the board, you might encourage others to do the same thing, or you might just start, might just ask some friends to do it with you. I think sometimes it can be comforting to be with people of the same ability, and at the same time you might provide that comfort for other people by getting started on the board. I very much believe everybody who wants to get started on a board can, and I very much believe that we all belong there.
Yeah, there are definitely people who believe the opposite, that that not everyone deserves to be on a training board. And I think, all gyms will have these people. But I would say majority of climbers really love to see people trying hard and moving outside of their comfort zone. So I would say, like, for sure, don't let others stop you. Um, yeah, yes, there is a risk of injury for beginners. And again, we just listed ways to kind of mitigate that. Um, if you aren't climbing, V3 or V4 in the gym, and then all of a sudden you're trying to hop on a training board at 50 degrees, it's not going to go well. And you're going to put yourself at risk for injury. So, just keep these things in mind. Like, meet yourself where you're at. And again, it's okay to change the angle, um, and just get started. Like, I think I started using spray walls and systems boards when I was also like climbing not very hard, but the people around me were so encouraging that it felt totally fine to be on these training boards.
Yeah, when I started climbing on the moon board, I couldn't do the V4s on the moon board, just like you said. They were way too hard for me, and it was very discouraging because I did not consider V4 a hard grade on a commercial gym set. But the moon board 2016, it's a huge ego check. And especially the benchmarks. They say V4, they're not V4. I'm just going to put it out there. So the grading on the moonboard is all over the place. And that's another reason I don't love for beginners to necessarily start on the moonboard, because it's so discouraging. I feel like you might be climbing V6, honestly, like you said, your wife can climb V6 outside, but the moonboard is just like, even if you climb V6, some of the V4s I feel like are harder than V8, literally, in my opinion.
Totally.
So
totally.
It just is all. That's another, actually, the boards I feel like are more size dependent too, depending on who set the climb. If someone had a very different body shape than you have, then it might get really hard for you real quick.
Yeah. And that is something to think about. I feel like Stephen Dimmitt might have just like talked about this on one of his podcasts. Like, he had a solo podcast about his tension board, because he also just got a tension board too. And honestly, like, this is why I like to climb on these boards, because I'm climbing V4 on a moon board, but outside I'm climbing V8. So that's pretty great. Like, I really set myself up for success by training on the moon board at very much lower grades. And I think that's true maybe across the boards. I think the boards are all a little bit harder in some instances than actually climbing outside. So keep that in mind. If it feels hard, great. If you're an outdoor climber, you have something to look forward to when you go outside.
Yeah, totally. Okay, Mercedes, should we just briefly talk about some etiquette when it comes to board climbing? Since when it comes to board climbing, everybody kind of wants to climb the same things on the same board. So there's a bit of a crowded space at times. So maybe let's just get into a few things, because sometimes when we go into a crowded area and we don't know how to behave, it can also be intimidating. So we wanted to give just a few practical tips on how to navigate those. Do you want to get started?
Yeah. I think it would be good to. I personally think that if you want to start on the training board, going there at the busiest time of day, probably not the best idea. I highly recommend that you find a time that works for you that isn't after 4 or 5 p.m. So that you have a higher likelihood of only a couple people, maybe nobody on the training board. But let's say like you do find a time and you go to the gym and there's like 1 or 2 people on the board. It's really great to just communicate to the people who are already using the board that, hey, you'd really like to step in and work on certain climbs. And what I normally do is I just say, hey, like, is it okay if I join you? Like, what angle are you working at? And then I will sometimes, depending on maybe the vibe, I will just say, hey, this is what I'm working on, because sometimes I am working on specific drills and I'm not working on climbs. And so I have fixed times that I'm resting. And so I'll let them know. I'll say, hey, I need to climb 2 of these back to back. And then I'm going to take a really big break. Is that going to be okay? Is that going to work for you? And, they might say no. I've never had anyone say no. But you do want to be mindful to not be up, like, you don't want to be on the board. I see this happen in commercial gyms too, where you're kind of standing next to the board and you're looking at things for a while. Like, you don't want to do that. You're taking up time now that someone else could be using the board. So if you're trying to suss out beta, make sure that you're doing it while you're sitting down or you're further away from the board so that you can allow people to just step in. So yeah, I think that the first thing is just like not necessarily asking for permission, but kind of like it's just like you would when you go outside and there's a couple people on the same boulder that you want to work on. You just say, hey, what's up? Like, you having a good session? Do you mind if I, join you? And normally with that approach, people are always super nice and really welcoming. Yeah, so that would be kind of like how I would first kind of approach that.
Yeah, totally. Because the space gets so crowded, communication is key. And so, as Mercedes said, if someone's already in the board, talk to them. And it's not so much asking for permission, even though it is. I don't know how to say it better either. It's not asking for permission in that no one can deny you the board. It's just showing respect that someone is on the board, and kind of asking them what they're working on. And at least in my gym, there is a bit of a unspoken rule that whoever is on the board first kind of like owns it, depending on the board, that person might control the lights. Some boards nowadays, I just want to say that it's really great. It's really easy to switch between apps. So if you want to climb a different climb, it's really easy for you to put on your climb onto the board and then switch off with another person. It's really easy. But for the old moon board, it's not that easy to do. So in my gym, whoever is there first controls the lights, and people tend to be really nice about it. But just like bringing in open communication, just showing up, ask if you can join. That's a really nice question to ask. As you said, sometimes people do train on the board, and sometimes it's more difficult to join. But if someone trains on a board at such high intensity that it's really hard for you to join, then chances are good they're not going to be on the board for very long. So they might just be on the board for a really short amount of time, but for that short amount of time, they might really need to use the board, and it might be hard for you to hop in. But in either case, that communication will establish, when and how you can climb. Those are the 2 things that I usually do is I ask if I can join, and then I let people know what my plan is. What is my goal for the board? Am I projecting and just sitting around a lot? Do I need the lights? Sometimes I tell them I don't even need to use the lights. And it's just communication really is key. And you'll find that, with that friendliness, you're inviting, other people to communicate also. And with that, it's pretty easy. And at the beginning, I would even tell people, hey, I'm really new to this board. Or actually, and now actually what happens to me is the other way around, where other people come in, they're really new to the board, and I can tell they're nervous and they say that they're really new to the board. And, I just let them know that I started somewhere too, and I ask them if I can help them somehow. And that's another reason for perhaps sharing with other people that you're new to the board, is that then they might bring extra patience for you and might even want to help you if you want that help from these people. So communication is definitely key. I don't recommend to just walk up to the board and just start climbing like you would actually do in commercial gyms, right? In commercial gyms, we do just walk up and we just start climbing. On the boards, I find the communication is a bit more important. And also just makes it so much more comfortable and fun.
Yeah, like it kind of is a good introduction to how you would approach outdoor bouldering or even outdoor lead climbing, you'd have a lot of communication between you and the other people. Another thing, shoot, I forgot. Maybe it'll come back to me, but I do have something else. If you are working on some similar holds that the other person is working on that isn't like these holds aren't very good, get into the habit of brushing. Make sure that you've got a little brush with you. Most gyms have brushes, but they normally have the big ones that can be a little annoying to use on the training boards because those holds are smaller. So definitely get into a habit of brushing these holds. And even if you're on it by yourself, there's a lot of volume on these holds. That means a lot of chalk is getting accumulated on these boards. The board holds are basically permanent. So the gyms aren't taking these holds off and washing them and then putting them back on. That would be a lot of work. So it's very different to commercial setting where they're taking the holds off every 6 weeks and then they're replacing them with like super clean holds. All right. So get into the habit of brushing, and they really need the brushing. All right. So invest in a nice little brush and start using it.
Yeah, it's a great way of resting too. Sometimes I just brush the holds. It helps me rest. I get really anxious, especially when I climb by myself, wanting to jump on the board. But I just had to laugh, Mercedes. I have to share this with you. I'm so sorry that your gym does not take off the holds and wash them. My gym takes off the holds and they wash them and they put them back on. It's so nice.
I don't know how you would do it with the tension board too. Like every hold has 3 screws in it. So there's really no way that you can do that. I think the moon board, I've seen them take the holds off once a year and clean them.
But yeah, definitely not very often, even if they do it. But they are kind of permanent and they do get greasy. So brushing is a really great idea.
And here's a tip for if you want to make friends. This is how you make friends. You brush their holds for them. Like as they're like kind of getting ready, if you're like there brushing the holds and say, "Hey, I'm gonna just brush the holds for you," that person's gonna love you. That is how to win friends in the climbing gym. Brush their holds.
Yeah. Just to go back to changing the angles, you said this earlier, Mercedes, that is something, again, there's no rules about it. It's not to say that you couldn't change the angle, but it's not difficult to change the angle, but it's not all that easy. So it is nice to keep a board at a certain angle if possible. So if you walk up to a group, they're climbing at a certain angle, but you want to climb at a different one. Again, communication is key. If you just want to try a project once or twice, you might be able to ask them to see if you could change the angle. But what I would recommend, just for ease of it, and everybody will appreciate this, if you do see the board at an angle that you don't want to climb at, just ask these people how long they think they might session on a board. And as I said, most people don't session super long on these boards because you do get pretty tired. And so, yep, they might just be on for another 30 minutes and then you can have the board and change it to the angle that you want to have it at. And then once you change the angle to where you want to have it at, that's kind of like set for you. So you should climb on it then until the next person comes and they're going to have to wait for you. That's kind of how it works. It's kind of like, whoever's there first at my moonboard controls the lights. That moonboard doesn't change the angle. But when you climb on other boards where you can change the angle, kind of like whoever was there first or next in line gets to decide which angle to climb at. But again, communication is key. Not to say you couldn't change it, but it is not easy to do.
I just remembered what I was going to say. This is about beta spray. Going back to what you were saying, Katja, about having communication with others if you're feeling intimidated, or if you're on the other side of it where you see someone feeling like looking intimidated by the board and doesn't really know what they're doing. Just make sure that you're asking for, if you're the more experienced climber, just have it like be open about like, hey, I'm here to help. Just like let me know if you want any help or advice. Do not be that person that is now just splaining them every step, because a big part of learning is people failing or like bumping around with like how they're doing it. That's how you learn fastest, rather than someone telling you what to do. And it's kind of like, it's a little weird, if you're just trying to splain someone. So just FYI, I feel like I see that a lot, especially if it's a female walking up to a climb that, or a board that there's a lot of dudes. Like I've seen it the other way too, but just be aware of how much beta you're giving someone.
Yeah, can I share a personal story with that? Because there's
Yeah.
a bit of a dynamic thing. I want to share the story because that was actually from climbing outside, but I went climbing with a bunch of guys because sometimes that happens, still in the climbing community. They were super friendly and I really enjoy climbing with them, but there is sometimes this idea of people think they know better. And, I want to just really, I'm telling this story because I want people, women, or honestly any kind of human who climbs, I want to encourage them to explore their own body and their own climbing, how it suits them. And other people might have ideas, but even if they have strong opinions, and I will share my story, even if you feel like they're established climbers in the community, it doesn't matter. It is just an opinion, even if they state it as a fact. So I was working this one traverse, which I love doing traverses and I love using heel hooks. And I really wanted to do this one move using a heel hook. And there's a very well-known root setter, and he's pretty established, and most people know him, so I'm not going to say names, telling me that I won't be able to do it with my heel. I need to use a toe. I will say I did not ask for that advice. And I'm someone who can get a little charged up by these things. And then I really like to prove people that I can do it. So of course I did it. And he was impressed. But needless to say, that's not what it's about. It's about, I was even thinking, I was unsure of myself in that moment when he said that. And the reason I want to share this story is because he's such an established root setter. And I always looked up to him as someone in climbing who knows movement really well. And it's just the way he said it. Like, you can't do it this way, you need to do it that way. It wasn't even a suggestion to try the toe. He literally said, you can't do it with the heel. And then I did it with the heel. So just to prove the point, it was doable with the heel. And it was not really kind to tell me I couldn't do it that way, since he didn't even climb with me all that often. So I want to share that story just because sometimes we do get into situations where we look up to other people because they climb better or we know them, from the community, and we might think they're right, but they might not be right. Something might just work for you. And I have other endless stories for this too, because I just love finding my own beta, and I've really learned to listen to my own body, and it's worked really well for me. And you might just climb something differently, and you should always try to explore your body for yourself.
Like really I feel like coaches, this is a really good area for coaches to fill, is like, okay, we'll guide you to things that you can do, maybe things that aren't as possible. But even as a coach, to say something like that, like I would never say anything like that, because again, everyone's going to be different, and the learning styles are going to be different. You're going to learn more if you figure it out on your own. If you're a good coach, you don't give the answer away. They got to figure it out for themselves. So like even as a coach, I think like giving too much beta is just not good in general, and that sucks. I'm sorry that you experienced that. Maybe we should do a podcast on beta spray. I have a lot of really horrible stories. A lot, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And I guess to me too, it's almost like I actually like beta. I like ideas and suggestions. I love trying new and different things. But to me, there's a difference between making suggestive comments to try something new versus telling someone you can't do it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that doesn't sit well with me for sure. And it's interesting because even I love watching competitive climbing. If you watch competitive climbing, do you know how often it happens where the commentary says, oh, the root setter said you can't do it this way. And they are used to this. They're used to athletes showing them they're wrong. Root setters might say this, the commentators might say, you're not supposed to be able to do it this way. And one athlete will do it just the way they think you can't do it, just to show them what's possible. And so it happens at all levels, so it's really interesting to see. And I love that about climbing. We should all, express ourselves on the wall and climb however we want to and however we can.
Yep. That's why the sport is so great. We love this sport. All right, well, let's wrap this episode up. I hope you take these tips and like really like take these tips with you to the gym. I would like write some of these down, go to the gym and just ease yourself in and just have fun on these training boards. Cool.
Thanks for joining us.
All right. We'll see y'all soon. Goodbye.